if the understanding of the morally good will is clear, we can now move to the distinction between moral duty and inclination. The distinction between moral duty and psychological inclination, between what Kant regards as a legitimate rational basis for morality and the empirical impurities that are no part of morality, construed as the duty to act from rather than merely in accord with the moral law, can now be seen and be thoroughly examined. Kant argues that duty, directed action, is necessary and altogether distinct from matters of inclination. Let's read this one in blue font or blue color. Now, an action from duty is to put aside entirely the influence of inclination, and with it every object of the will. Hence, there is left for the will nothing that could determine it except objectively the law, and subjectively pure respect for this practical law. And so the maxim of complying with such a law, even if it infringes upon all my inclinations. There's a mark about what a maxim is, and it's important also to look at how they define maxim. Kant explains a maxim is the subjective principle of volition, the objective principle, that is, that which would also serve subjectively as the practical principle for all rational beings if reason had complete control over the faculty of desire, is the practical law. No, let's go back. Sorry, I have to show you only the portion that we've considered, precisely because the second set refers to a second quote to look at, which we will see in a bit. No? So Kant involves the same criterion we have previously considered in connection with this distinction between acting for the sake of the moral law as opposed to merely in conformity with the moral law. The test is to ask whether the action would be undertaken contrary to inclination, or in the extreme case, as Kant says above, and more clearly, it says there, even if it infringes upon all my inclinations. Importantly, Kant argues that the moral value of what an agent does is not a function of the consequences it produces. This makes Kant's moral philosophy fundamentally different from ethical systems that determine moral value on the basis of whether they produce greater total happiness than unhappiness, which Kant emphatically opposes. We can now go to the succeeding blue quotation. Thus, the moral worth of an action does not lie in the effect expected from it, and so too does not lie in any principle of action that needs to borrow its motive from these expected effects. For all these effects, agreeableness of one's condition, indeed even promotion of one's happiness, could have been also brought about by other causes, so that there would have been no need for these of the will of a rational being, in which, however, the highest and unconditional good alone can be found. Hence, nothing other than the representation of the law in itself, which can, of course, occur only in a rational being, insofar as it is, and not the hope for effect, is the determining ground of the will, can constitute the preeminent good we call moral, which is already present in the person himself, who acts in accordance with this representation and need not wait upon the effect of his action. A standard terminology for distinguishing Kantian ethics from those that attribute moral value to the consequences of actions is that between the ontology and consequentialism. The Kantian deontologist maintains that morality is derived from the intentions or moral psychological state of an agent and not from the effects of the actions that the agent decides to perform. The consequentialist holds just the opposite, that intentions are irrelevant to the morality of an action, except insofar as they contribute to the overall effect it produces in creating more happiness or unhappiness, or the like psychological consequences, an empirical aspect of morality that Kant must disavow as irrelevant to questions of morality. The concept of moral good, Kant believes, is found only in the mind's internal representation of the moral law as the determining ground of the will. The will represents to itself the moral law, and in so doing fixes its resolve on achieving the moral law for its own sake. If there is anything else other than the representation of the moral law in the will, then the will is not pure. And in particular, it is not the pure moral will. The will, in that case, as already indicated, is contaminated by the other empirical psychological factors that can affect its decisions, such as inclination, desire, concern for the consequences of an action, or the like, any and all of which transform an action undertaken from and exclusively for the sake of the moral law into something that Kant is committed to classifying as strictly extramoral. Kant considers the case of someone who knowingly makes a false promise and applies the standard of whether the action is motivated entirely and exclusively by the will's internal representation of the moral law. We can read that in the succeeding quotation. Let's read this. However, to inform myself in the shortest yet infallible way about the answer to this problem, whether a lying promise is in conformity with duty, I ask myself, would I indeed be content that my maxim, to get myself out of difficulties by a false promise, should hold as a universal law for myself as well as for others? And could I indeed say to myself that everyone may make a false promise when he finds himself in a difficulty he can get out of in no other way? Then I soon become aware that I could indeed will the lie, but by no means a universal law to lie. For in accordance with such a law, there would properly be no promises at all, since it would be futile to avow my will with regard to my future actions to others who would not believe this avowal, or, if they rashly did so, would pay me back in like coin. And thus my maxim, as soon as it were made a universal law, would have to destroy itself. Kant makes several important points in this passage. He indicates the way in which the will's internal representation of the moral law is supposed to exclude all empirical psychological factors and in particular, all aspects of inclination. The morally pure will has regard for moral duty as the only remaining basis for judging the moral value of the action, while concentrating exclusively on internal representation of the moral law as the only principle by which to determine whether the action is properly moral or has some other motivation. Kant gives specific content to the form in which the will represents the moral law, thereby foreshadowing the most important moral principle of his ethical theory. He speaks of these as a universal law in a very definite sense. What makes the moral law universal in Kant's theory is that the agent can will the maxim or particular principle that guides the action to be accepted and followed by every moral agent. We shall need to look more carefully at Kant's reference to this statement of universal law. The important conclusion at this stage is that the will's internal representation of the universal moral law is supposed to be the only determinant of a genuinely moral action that falls properly under the metaphysics of morals. If the will's internal representation of the universal moral law is in fact the only thing that determines an action, then all extraneous empirical, psychological, and prudential considerations, especially those connected with desire or inclination, are necessarily excluded, as Kant requires. The proper subject of moral philosophy is thereby purified of any non-rational elements, particularly because the judgment that the moral maxim is universalizable is based entirely on reason and involves no element of passion or emotion. The action will also necessarily then be undertaken from and not merely in conformity with the moral law, reflecting the agent's commitment to moral duty as opposed to feeling, inclination, or expectation of consequence. Kant summarizes this thought of the agent's intentions and the will's internal representation of the universal law in designating an act as genuinely moral. These are the only circumstances in which the will can be regarded as unqualifiedly good and hence as the only thing that is purely unqualifiedly or intrinsically good. Let's read this one in blue. I do not, therefore, need any penetrating acuteness to see what I have to do in order that my volition be morally good. Inexperienced in the course of the world, incapable of being prepared for whatever might come to pass in it, I ask myself only, can you also will that your maxim become a universal law? If not, then it is to be repudiated, and that not because of a disadvantage to you or even to others forthcoming from it, but because it cannot fit as a principle into a possible giving of universal law. For which law-giving reason, however, forces from me immediate respect. Although I do not see what this respect is based upon, these the philosopher may investigate, I at least understand this much, that it is an estimation of a worth that far outweighs any worth of what is recommended by inclination, and that the necessity of my action from pure respect for the practical law is what constitutes duty, to which every other motive must give way, because it is the condition of a will in itself the worth of which surpasses all else. Interesting. To emphasize the extent to which it is difficult to determine in practice whether an action is undertaken exclusively from duty or respect for the moral law by means of the will's internal representation of a universal moral principle, Kant states that we can never be sure that an action is undertaken for purely moral reasons as opposed to inclination. The assertion has frequently been misunderstood by commentators, for which Kant is no doubt partly to blame. Let us first consider what he says, and let me go to the second part. And here it is. In fact, he says, it is absolutely impossible by means of experience to make out with complete certainty a single case in which the maxim of an action otherwise in conformity with duty rested simply on moral grounds and on the representation of one's duty. That is the quote in question. It is indeed sometimes the case that with the keenest self-examination, we find nothing besides the moral ground of duty that could have been powerful enough to move us to think, or that good action and to so great a sacrifice. But from this it cannot be inferred with certainty that no covert impulse of self-love, under the mere pretense of that idea, was not actually the real determining cause of the will. For we like to flatter ourselves by falsely attributing to ourselves a nobler motive, whereas in fact we can never even, by the most strenuous self-examination, get entirely behind our covert incentives. Since when moral worth is at issue, what counts is not action which one sees, but those inner principles of actions that one does not see. That's the latter part is interesting. When moral worth is an issue, what counts is not actions which one sees, but those inner principles of actions that one does not see. Kant's remarks have been understood as meaning that it is impossible or virtually impossible to act in a morally correct way, as though Kant was imposing impossible standards that human agents could never satisfy. What Kant actually claims, however, on a close and careful, even if philosophically unsympathetic reading, is rather that it is virtually impossible to determine experientially whether or not an action is undertaken from respect for the moral law or as a result of inclination. He asserts that we cannot always tell, even in the most astute cases of self-examination, whether we are acting from a sense of duty or by or because of some other motivation. Hence, according to the moral principle he has advanced, we cannot always tell whether we are acting morally, or let us say prudentially or emotionally, or by some other spur to action. Experientially, we cannot judge whether another person is acting from moral duty or from some other private motive because we cannot see into their hearts. And for much the same reason, we cannot even tell in our own case exactly why we do what we choose to do. If we could know ourselves well enough to discover our true motives, then we could know in a given case whether we act from duty toward rather than merely in accord with the moral law. Unfortunately, persons and their hidden motives are not so transparent even to themselves. We are much more complex creatures than that, and we cannot even always discover the real workings of our psyches. That, in any case, is Kant's conclusion as he contemplates the depths of the human will. If we do not know whether a person is acting from a sense of duty or merely in accord with the moral law, then we cannot decide what in any particular instance is moral behavior. To recognize this limitation is not to contradict the theoretical truth that morality consists of a certain state of mind, an intention with which action is pursued that makes it the product of a goodwill as the only unqualifiedly good thing. Kant, with remarkable, almost 21st century insight, argues that even when we can discover in our own motives nothing more self-serving than the desire to act in accord with the demands of moral duty, we still cannot be sure that we are not driven by a secret impulse of self-love. The real reasons why we do what we do may be disguised even from the most searching scrutiny and may involve motives that have more to do with inclination than we may be willing to acknowledge. We are capable of subconsciously deluding and deceiving ourselves with respect to our motivations to such an extent that we cannot always know whether we are acting morally or for reasons that are logically irrelevant to considerations of morality. If you like this content, please share, click, and like and subscribe to this channel, Samo't Sari sa Simula. Thank you very much.